All right, so I may just wander around when I'm talking because I don't like standing still. So let me know if you can't hear me and I'll use the microphone, but otherwise I won't. So I just wanted to talk about working in relationship and I guess offer some ideas for how to do that and also offer some traditional wisdom about what happens when you don't. So I hope that you can get a lesson out of this, at least, that how things work. So I think that for me that it's important that when we're talking about working in relationships, we're talking about working in respectful relationships. So it's not like an abusive relationship, but it's respectful. Because they haven't always been that way, and especially with Indigenous people, we've had a long history of not being in respectful relationships, but being abused by our relationships with Western institutions. So there's a fair bit of work that needs to get done at an institutional level in order to overcome some of the historical injustices that have taken place. And so I'll maybe talk a little bit about that as well. But I think, to me, it's important to recognize that things need to change because we are at a place where, well, historically we've faced, everyone knows about colonization, so that's been our history, is the history of colonization. But the place where we're at now, unfortunately, is a place, because colonization was so successful, we're at a place where it's almost like we've been mentally enslaved. So it's a place now where we're in mental slavery, and we're in so the sort of psychology of dependency is taken over in a lot of Indigenous communities. So the work that I do is I try to envision, so what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? And a lot of that stuff is around retaining that respect, getting back to a place where we are have respect for ourselves, have respect in our relationships. So that is, to me, that's the important stuff and what we need to do. Okay, so it's hard to know, like when I'm talking with people, what background information that they have. But I'm hoping most of you know, like, sort of a bit of the history of colonization and how that's impacted on Indigenous people. So there's been, whether it was in United States and Canada or South America or Australia or Africa, a lot of places around the world, colonization has really taken sort of similar steps in how it has happened. So a lot of time, colonization really becomes like looking at like an exploitation of resources. So people from outside come in hoping to exploit the resources in an area. So that resources often can be like the land itself, so taking minerals or fur or oil is a lot of the time these days, or diamonds is the big one these days, taking resources out of the land. But the next big thing that often happens or in conjunction with that is the exploitation of the people. So we're all aware of the slave trade, how that was started in North America, taking slaves back, taking the Native Americans back to Europe as slaves, and then it really expanded, bringing African people over to work in plantations here. So it was the exploitation of the people was the next step in the colonization. But then that wasn't really enough because you can't just take people without, pardon me, basically the next thing that happened has been the removal of the children. And that's sort of the next stage of colonization, was around forced assimilation. Sorry, excuse me. Talking about this stuff chokes me up. So that's been something that's been ongoing for a long time, is the forced removal of Indigenous peoples and the desire to make them or remake them in the image of the colonizers. And unfortunately, that has been extremely successful. So we're at a place where that assimilation has taken place a lot, and so it's become the whole subjugation of a whole groups of people and whole landscapes is a big part of the colonial process. So we have to really think about, well, what are the impacts of that subjugation and that forced assimilation, and what does that mean? What has that done? What has that done to people? For example, a big thing that has happened in every country as well is that they outlaw the local religions and the local spiritual practices. So, all of this stuff has happened in our past, right? And it's like we have to be aware of how this colonial history, it's not like, America is great because, we did all this stuff. It's great because you stole all this stuff, and you stole the labor of the people, and you stole the people from Africa and brought them here to make it. Stole the resources from the people that were living here already. So it's like you have to recognize that that's kind of the history we're coming from. So if you want things to change, you got to be in recognition of that. But I think that a lot of people realize that, right? Okay, and they think, oh yeah, okay, we can recognize that, slavery happened. We recognize the forced removal of children. But I think what people haven't gotten to yet is the point where they recognize how part of that subjugation of people has been the systematic denial of their ways of thinking. So it's been a systematic denial of Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge. So it's like it's become to a place where Indigenous science has been really denigrated, and it's, you get called witch doctors, or they get called shamans if they're a traditional healer. And it's sort of that has been part of the colonial process. We have to recognize that when we come to institutions of research and learning, that there has been also a history of that learning has been at the expense of traditional knowledge, and has been at the expense of Indigenous ways of teaching and pedagogy and all those sort of things. So we have to remember that when we're trying to change the way things are. All right, so I would say that there's been a history of physical violence and resource exploitation, but there's also been a real history of, and current today, epistemic violence or ontological violence, so violence against the ways of thinking of different Indigenous peoples around the world. So, obviously that means that there's a lot of distrust. As a researcher, you can't just go into any Indigenous community and say, I come from MSU, I want to do some research here. They'll be like, yeah, right. Okay. There is distrust of the system because there is that knowledge that the system is not there to help you. The system is there to hold you down. So change is really necessary if we want to make things better. And I guess to me, there's like a sense of urgency with this, because it's like, when you talk about colonization and stuff, it's like, well, yeah, that's in the past, and everyone, let it go. It's like, why can't you move on from there? But we have to recognize that this is happening right now. Yes, it's been ongoing for the last 500 years, but it's still happening right now. Like if we look at, say, like the rates of child removal, right now there's more children living in state care than there ever was when the residential schools were taking place, okay? So even though, I think in the 2001 census, American Indian Alaska Native kids had actually lower rates of physical and sexual abuse than mainstream white kids. And yet, they were in care of the state at a much higher rate than white kids. So like, obviously this is still going on today. Kids are still being taken and raised in foster care or raised in institutions today. So like in Canada, there's a good example is like the way education is funded for primary and secondary school is on average around $4,000 less funding goes towards per year goes towards educating Indigenous kids, First Nations kids that have treaty rights, than goes towards educating everyone else. So it's like, well, how is you can see, so this colonial process is still taking place today, and we allow it to keep happening. So that's why to me, there's like a real urgency. We can't just sit around and say, yeah, okay, well, that was in the past. Let's move on. It's like, okay, we need to recognize that this is still happening right now. And if we want something to change, we have to start doing things about it. So anyway, where are those people from community psychology? I was looking at this slide and I was thinking, there's the slide. That's how you engage in cultural competency. Not that you can see it, but it's just pretty. So I can share that with you later if you want. So why? Well, why she'd listen to me about this, I guess, is a common thing. So I didn't really start this out properly, as in how I should have been following protocol. Normally, protocol would be to introduce myself first. So I just wanted to get you all hyped up first. But obviously, I've been having too much coffee. So I'm Shawn Wilson. I'm a Pasqua Cree from northern Manitoba. So my people have lived in the sort of like if you imagine a map of North America, and right in the center of it, well, the geographical center is like in northern North Dakota. If you look up from the geographical center, straight up from there, that's where I'm from. Probably if you went up like about 500 miles more north. Okay, so I would say it's, the geographical center of North America is in the middle of North Dakota, but the center of the world really is 500 miles from there north. Okay, the center of the real world. So my parents are Stan and Peggy Wilson. My grandparents have lived on that area for an awful long time. So my family names are Wasanas and Kanachich. And I guess that I was talking with my dad about this, how long we've lived there. And one of my other uncles was saying, well, there's stories about 4 ice ages ago, this happened, and we had to send some people down south. And it was like, so we've got oral tradition stories of living there for 4 ice ages. So it's not like it's, like we've just been there for the last 1,000 years or something. We've been there for tens of thousands of years. And stories about how, of the migration south and moving back home again afterwards, after the glaciers retreat. So we've been there a long time, right? So we've got a lot of knowledge of the land in a Pasqua Cree Nation. Okay, so that's where I'm from. And it also is part of who I am. So as an Indigenous person, I identify with my home community and my home land. My grandfather was a trapper, and he was a trapper all his life. And my father grew up on the trap line up until he was about 12 and went away to residential school. And then, so he's never really spoke English until he went away to residential school. So that's sort of where I come from. So now I'm a father of 3 boys, and that's really important to me. To start to think about, well, okay, yeah, I'm a child of and a grandchild of and great-great-grandchild of people from that land, but I'm also a father, a grandfather to be, a great-grandfather to be, a great-great-great-grandfather of children to be that will be from that land, and they are Indigenous to that land, and we are Indigenous to this land. So right now I work at, I guess maybe, so I've got that tradition, and I was extremely fortunate in my upbringing in that even though my dad went to residential school, so we kind of lost a lot of the language in our family, but he still was very careful to try and bring us up in a way that was cultural. So we were always involved in community events, and I've had a lot of training in how do I put this? I've attended a lot of different ceremonies, and I've had a lot of different training in our spiritual practices in my upbringing, and a lot of training from a lot of different traditional elders. So that's been a real good part of my life. But also because my parents both went on and finished their PhDs, so they were, I think, the 3rd and 4th or 4th and 5th ever treaty Indians to get their doctorates in Canada. I've also had fortunate to have that background where I've also had a lot of, coming from a family that has a real knowledge of the education system and how education works. So it's having that a foot in both worlds, I guess. So I've had that traditional upbringing and traditional knowledge, but also real knowledge of how the system works and how to work in Western educational settings. So that's sort of what I bring into the work that I do, is being able to sometimes translate between those two different worldviews. And so that's oftentimes what I'm trying to do. So right now I work at Guinea College, which is Southern Cross University is a smaller university in Lismore area. Where it's in the northeastern part of the state of New South Wales in Australia. And when I tell people oftentimes from up here at Southern Cross University, they think, oh, it must be a Christian college or something. But it's Southern Cross is like if you imagine the Big Dipper, it's a star constellation that points towards where the South Pole is. So it's the Southern Cross University is actually named after a constellation in the southern sky. But where I live is Bundjalung territory. And the Bundjalung name for that constellation is Guinea. And Guinea is a black swan. Well, black swan flying. So their name for that constellation is because it looks like a black swan flying. It's got the same proportions as a black swan when it's flying. And it's kind of like one of those weird sort of coincidence type things. I don't know if you know much about like the idea of Southern knowledge, and you know, there's the Western knowledge and the Northern knowledge. Now it sort of has really been denigrating of Southern knowledge. So we've got a whole lot of knowledge from out of Africa and out of the southern parts of the world that is ignored. So this is Guinea theory. We've been working on Guinea theory. So there's a theory like black swan theories. There used to be an expression in England that to say, oh, that's about as likely as a black swan, because no one had ever swans are white. It was an expression, but so it wasn't until they traveled to Australia and realized, oh, actually there are black swans, that saying was like, oh, okay, that doesn't really apply here, right? There's a whole theory built around that idea that we can only know what we know, and there's going to be always things that we don't know about yet because we haven't experienced them. So we have to be open to learning about new things and accept the fact that just because that's our common experience now doesn't mean that it's going to happen. Something's going to happen 5 minutes from now that may change everything, right?